What Drives You is brought to you by Ziglar, your premier source for equipping life and leadership coaches. Visit Ziglar.com and let them inspire your true coaching performance.
Yeah.
Welcome. I'm Kevin Miller. This is What Drives You, the podcast for driven people who want to reach great destinations and enjoy the ride every day. We're continuing our series here, part 3 on interdependence, which we began with interdependence expert and international trauma facilitator, Thomas Hübl, whose new book is titled Attuned, Practicing Interdependence to Heal Our Trauma and Our World. Well, here I continue discussion with a friend and often collaborator with Thomas William Ury. And I often bring on past guests for this part 3 segment. This time, I think it's maybe the first time I'm bringing on a future guest. Bill and I spent about 3 hours together recently and talking about his book. And he and Thomas, though, found out that they're well acquainted. They've done a lot together. But to fill you in on William, he's one of the world's best known experts on negotiation. And he's the co-author of Getting to Yes, which you likely know about that book. It's the world's all-time best-selling book on the topic. More than 15 million copies sold. He's co-founder of Harvard's program on negotiation and has devoted his life to helping people, organizations, and nations transform conflicts around the world. Having served as a negotiator in many of the toughest disputes of our times. He's consulted with the White House, the State Department, the Pentagon. His upcoming book, which you can actually pre-order right now, when this show publishes, it won't be officially out yet, but give it a couple of weeks, but you can pre-order it now. It's titled Possible. That's what we spent a few hours talking about. Possible, how we survive and thrive in an age of conflict. We'll be digging further into that. You'll hear our series on that. But these two guys, Thomas Hübl and William Ury, are called on by countries and organizations around the globe to bring ultimately peace to relationships, whether that's nation to nation or person to person. So, Bill, just a gift to have you back.
My pleasure, Kevin, really.
Well, I have spent time looking online at the stuff you and Thomas have done together. And, I wanted to ask, just from a context standpoint, how did you guys come together? You obviously are literally around the globe being called on to help, like I said, nations and organizations and people and whatnot. How did you come together?
Well, we were brought together by a friend, but our first really big heart-to-heart in-person conversation actually took place in Jerusalem.
Oh, wow.
We met in Jerusalem. I was just about to go for a walk on the Abraham Path, which is a long-distance walking trail through the Middle East that follows the footsteps of Abraham and his family. And we had a conversation. It went on for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours in the American Colony Hotel there, and it just didn't stop. And we're just talking about everything from obviously the Middle East to trauma to how as human beings we come together, how we relate to each other, how we can navigate all these difficulties that we face.
Yeah.
And we decided out of that to continue the conversation. And he invited me to co-teach with him some of his courses.
That's incredible. So, when I look at you, when we have the show coming up on you, we're really focusing, on conflict and on negotiation. Thomas, obviously, from a billboard standpoint, it's trauma. He gets labeled under there. But in talking with both of you recently, obviously, and that's why you resonated so much, there's so much overlap of your focal points. Do that for me. Overlap. Both of you guys are working there, but when you take trauma and conflict, to some degree, they are. It's a massive overlap, maybe completely to some degree.
It is actually, it's something I've really, really appreciated more and more over time, that so many of the deep-rooted conflicts that I work on, be it in the Middle East or, Korea or Colombia or at home, in our political polarization, or at home, in family feuds or in business. So many conflicts, they seem to be on the surface about things, but actually underneath they're driven by unprocessed trauma that we have, that really causes us to react, to get angry, to get fearful. And then we're off to the races, an eye for an eye, and we all go blind. And so much of my work is kind of like bringing calm to the situation so people can think about what do you really want?
Yeah.
And what's really going to advance, what's going to make you happy in this situation?
When you look at
trauma's go ahead.
Well, when you look at the negotiation aspect of trying to bring people together, how much of the time do you end up dealing with I was going to say, well, you can help me unpack that. I was going to say the real and perceived trauma. That's probably not a fair statement. I mean, if it's perceived, it is real. If it's real, is that a fair way to even label it?
Yeah, it's felt trauma, really.
Felt, okay.
It's I find myself, I'm still a beginner in all of this. That's how I like to bring it anyway, beginner's mind. And as I mentioned, trauma is something as a subject, as a real subject of core interest has really come up in the last few years. But before that, I was always sensed it. I mean, there was so much of negotiation conflict is about deep-seated emotions, right? Yeah. Deep-seated emotions, and trauma is about when something overwhelming happens to us. It might be pain, it might be trauma, it might be shock, whatever it is. It might be something in our childhood. It as Thomas points out, it might even be something ancestral or collective, and it causes us to kind of numb out, to numb out those parts. And so we don't really feel, so we can't really bring our presence. And then we get triggered, just like PTSD. We get triggered by things that happen in daily life. And those things come up often in conflictual situations. And so you find people, negotiation is supposed to be a rational process where you're trying to figure out rationally what makes sense for you, what makes sense for the other, see if you can arrive at a mutually satisfactory solution. And yet, often what's in the way are emotions. Human beings were emotional creatures, and underneath those emotions, at the bottom of it, often is unprocessed trauma.
Gosh, there's so many directions to go with this. But with you, looking at negotiating, one of the big, let me lead off with this. In talking with Thomas, one of the first things that he said, which may be one of the first things that I just felt. I don't know if it's the first thing he said, but one of the first things that I felt was him talking about, he talked about in the show, he said, okay, when we walk into the woods, you and I just talked about that. You're up in Boulder. We're, probably an hour as the crow flies away from each other. So after we talk, we're both going to take our jaunts off into the woods. And he said, when you walk into the woods and perceive nature, if you're standing there, you're part of nature. That sounds so elementary to some degree, but that has continued to stick with me, Bill. I don't know why. It's just because I've looked at myself as this separate thing, trying to be a part of it, trying to perceive nature better maybe and get more out of it. And he's saying, hey, you're part of it. That alone was such a paradigm shift, I think. And it took me right away to my own propensity to be a me, them perspective in relationships. So here you are being brought in to negotiate, whether it's with family members in your own house or whether it's over in the Middle East. Do you find yourself doing that a lot, trying to bring these people together? Say, you guys are not, this is not an us, them. If we're going to figure this out, it's an us. It's not a me, them.
That's absolutely it, Kevin. It's that shift that's so hard for us to make, that movement from me to we,
Yes.
That journey, it's like they say the journey between the head and the heart is the longest journey in the world.
Yeah.
Between me and we, that's the great journey that we're all called upon to make. We live in this interdependent world, as you mentioned, and whether it's in our families or in our work lives or, in the larger conflicts that I often deal with, that shift from it's us against them, so it's two sides. It's us against them. It's, husband against wife. It's sales against manufacturing. It's labor against management. It's, Israelis against Palestinians, whatever the situation is. Actually, the shift is there's all of us together here.
Yeah.
And how do we jointly, one of the secrets of effective negotiation is to take what's so often a face-to-face confrontation. You're both sitting on opposite sides, across the table from each other and kind of glaring at each other, to you're on the same side of the table. It's an us. how do we deal with these difficulties that we have? And the problem is on the other side of the table. And how do we attack the problem rather than attack each other?
It's interesting as you point out the different. I learned, I was probably 17, 18, waiting tables, and I started being a server, and realized real quickly that there's the squabbles between the serving staff and the cooks. And thank goodness, because of my upbringing and understanding business, I was just beside myself. Like, how on earth can this, we're doing the same. We're all paid by the customer. I mean, we're all together. And yet that's the common thing we look at, even as we're on the same team. And yet, why is that? I tend to look at it as an American thing. And Thomas talks about that, the aspect of being dependent or independent. We're independent. But I assume that you experience that on a global level, that at some point we all have some bit of a sword that we wield that touts our dependence to our demise. Yes?
Yeah. I mean, there are these stages. And I remember when you were talking with Thomas, you go from, we start off in life, we're dependent, right?
Yeah.
Infants are dependent.
Yes, yeah.
And then we move and we start to add independence, and, a child, I've got a young grandchild who's just moving from dependence to independence, starting to say no. Mm-hmm. When you say no, you're kind of like moving, I have my separate tastes, independence. And then you move from independence into interdependence, where you have dependence, you have independence, and then you have interdependence, and that's the shift that we're always being invited to lean into, is how to keep our independence and be interdependent at the same time. They're not opposites. It's like, where do we have our autonomy within relationship, within community? And I think that's what we're being invited to do here in this country and around the world right now, is that journey of learning how to be interdependent. And that's what I found so fascinating about your conversation with Thomas.
How do you look at it? Just personally, how do you look? Because I don't know if I can define it right now, of how to, is it like a Venn diagram, or an overlap. If I look at my independence and my interdependence, do you look at it as trying to erase independence with interdependence, or they both have a place?
They both have a place. They both have a really important place. One of our basic human needs is autonomy. We want to have a little bit of control over our lives and over what really matters to us in our circle of concern.
And I'm nodding because I'm happy to hear you say that. I do like that. I'm trying to be open here, but I do feel like I love that, and I want that to be okay.
It's both. We want our autonomy and we want our connection. Human beings, we love to belong. We want to be part of things. We want, we love, that feeling of love, of that erases the separation.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of a both and of how do we balance both in our lives. And that's one of the key, that's the key puzzle we're always trying to kind of noodle on, in a marriage, in any kind of relationship, in a community. And right now, how do we foster our independence and at the same time cultivate our interdependence? That's the question.
When you're doing that in a negotiation setting and you're trying to get people, you're trying to connect people, you're trying to take the polarization that we tend to do and you're trying to connect them, how do you broach that interdependence? Because I feel like we probably have so much baggage. Everybody hearing this, there's going to be different words and perspectives that they attach onto interdependence. Does that mean that I'm supposed to have some reliance on you, or are you merely a possible benefit to me? Those are two different things.
Yeah. Well, the truth is, we are interdependent. It's, from the moment we're born, we rely on others, and as the poem by John Donne, no man is an island, no human being is alone. You can't survive alone in this world. We all need community. So we are interdependent. And how do we, that interdependence, because we are interdependent, in fact, we're increasingly interdependent, in this world right now where, everything is like made elsewhere, done elsewhere. It's like, to me, what we often bring to it, sometimes what we bring to it when it comes to conflict, is we bring this mindset, we bring this question of, okay, who's going to win?
Yeah.
Who's going to win this negotiation? And it's like asking the question of, who's going to win this marriage?
Yeah.
If you're asking that question, your marriage is in serious difficulty. And that's the same true of any human relationship. So the real question is, if you approach it as a kind of win-lose contest, inevitably, because of interdependence, oftentimes what happens is everybody loses. Both sides lose. The family loses. The community loses. The team, the restaurant loses. And so the choice is between, are we all going to lose, or can we all benefit? Can we all win in that sense? But win meaning meet some essential needs of ours and get what we essentially need. And that's the quest of negotiation to me in its highest sense.
It's interesting that you say that. It reminds me back in the days of just sales training and whatnot. And some of the debate between, is the customer always right? I mean, sometimes that's not always the case. But on the other side, I was taught well that, if you prove the customer wrong, you both lose. There's no win there. And I find that, again, even in personal relationships, if I look at a negotiation to win, I know right off the bat, I'm going to lose. So it forces the coming together. And when we look at trauma, I mean, talk about that again in your negotiations. And I'm going to try to overlap as best we can. And I think you do it so well. When you're talking about working with two countries, let's say, or two individuals, either way, that they're both there. And let's say that it is a trauma. Well, let me ask that in a negotiation, how many times in your work would you say, are you dealing just with a disagreement, just a differing perspective, or are you generally dealing with a felt trauma on one or both sides?
Well, I think everyone, to some extent, has trauma.
Yeah.
Each human being, you can't go through life without having some form of it. And so in some way, it influences everything. And because I deal with the really hard conflicts, whether it's, families getting in at it, or, bitter, battles in the workplace, or wars, trauma, I'm learning, over time, you start to see trauma and the influence of trauma just about everywhere. I'll give you just an example. I was working for about 7 years. I worked in the country of Colombia. I was an advisor to the president of Colombia, who was trying to bring an end to what everyone thought was absolutely impossible, a 50-year civil war where there were hundreds of thousands of deaths. It had claimed 8 million victims. And, the trauma in the society, you could just feel it palpably. And during the negotiation, the president had an idea, which was, I thought, a brilliant idea. It was the first time ever, probably, in any peace negotiation. During the peace negotiations itself, he said, let's bring people who've been victimized by this conflict, let's bring them to testify at the negotiations to the negotiators, just share their stories of what happened to them, just to kind of make everyone realize what the stakes were here. Yeah. And actually to begin a process of healing so that they could feel heard, because they went to the negotiations that were taking place actually in Cuba and Havana. And there was nationwide TV from Colombia. And there were these, groups, I think there were about like 6 groups of maybe 20 selected, individuals who had, men, women, black, white, victims of one side, victims of the other side. And they just told their stories, their human stories. And I remember everyone thought, this is a crazy idea. This is just going to kind of, bring out all kinds of, it's going to distract people from the negotiation. They're going to call out for vengeance and so on. But guess what? The opposite happened. The victims who had experienced the worst said, the most important thing now is to make sure that other people don't suffer what I've suffered.
Wow.
And I'll tell you a story of one of them that really moved the president. It was just to give you an example. It was a woman whose name was Pastora Mina, and she told the story of how one day she was in her house and a man came by. He was badly wounded from the conflict, and she took him in and she nursed him back to health. It took months. She put him in her son's bed and just nursed him back to health. And when he was ready to leave, as he was leaving, he suddenly looked on the wall in the living room and he saw a photograph of her with her son. And she said, "Is that your son? Is that your son?" And she said, "Yes, why?" And he said, "Oh, please forgive me. Please forgive me." She said, "Why?" "Because I was the one who tortured and killed your son."
Wow.
And please forgive me. And she said, "Get up." She said, "I want to thank you." He said, "Thank me?" She said, "Yeah, I want to thank you for liberating me from having to hate you for the rest of my life." And you know, that's that kind of story, when it's told by someone who experienced it, is healing to her because she feels seen and heard, but it was healing to all the people who heard that story. And it's that's trauma healing. That's when trauma begins slowly to heal, when people feel seen, heard. There's compassionate attention paid to what happened. It's not forgotten.
Yeah.
And then people can begin to put the past to rest, because otherwise you can reach an agreement, but the next thing, you know, the agreement breaks down because underlying it, the real conflict, which is trauma driven, hasn't been healed.
It's an unreal story. Well, that belies even me saying that it's unreal. It feels unreal. And when we look at conflict, when we look at that, you tortured my son, and we would depict that 9,999 times out of 10,000 that there would be a hate, bitterness, that there would be a desire for retribution, vengeance, revenge, those things. And yet you look at it, and if we stood back in an unbiased standpoint and go, gosh, what happened? What's the benefit? Well, here you are. The benefit, you're talking about it right now. You're telling the story right now. That's what came out of what she did, the positive. And if she went the other way, our human norm often to be violently bitter about that, upset about that, angry about that, we wouldn't be talking about it today. It produces nothing. And yet, how can we take that into our homes when we feel that offense? How can we do that regardless of the other person too? Because what if the guy, wasn't as contrite as that? She still had the opportunity to respond in a different way, but yeah, it feels unreal. It calls us. I mean, gosh, it's hard not to get spiritual, to be supernatural. I mean, this is the Bible, have peace beyond all understanding. That was what you just said right there is somewhat, well, it shouldn't be beyond all understanding. You understand that this is what you teach, and what the ripple effects of the positive outcome are infinite. And yet we often go the other way, and it's just a roadblock. Yes.
That's it, Kevin. It's, just one human being making one courageous step like she did. And, I heard many stories like that. I mean, maybe not quite as dramatic, but I remember one fellow who his entire family had been killed by a bomb that the guerrillas had put in a church. The people in the village had taken refuge in the church, and a rocket had hit it. And I don't know if it was by accident or not, but more than 100 people were killed, and just in a little village, and so many wounded. And he lost his whole family. He was young too. I think he was, it was a boy. And he got up and said, nothing's going to bring them back, but I forgive the people who did it. And when he did that, he speaks to the entire people and says, okay, we have to find a way to move on, and it's not, maybe these are, I mean, these are ordinary human beings who are just kind of like do extraordinary things. And yet each one of them helps the collective. And that's what's needed, because in this world, conflict resolution is not just about negotiation, it's about healing. And I think that's the message that Thomas brings in his work is, how do we heal? How do we heal individually? How do we heal relationally? And how do we heal collectively?
Because when you look at negotiation, I would tend to think that the common perception is you negotiate, you're looking for equitable terms. You're just looking for, I mean, my gosh, I've been in some recently, and I'm thinking about a bit of a conflict, a contract, a business thing and whatnot. And you're looking for equitable terms. When have we ever sought to truly understand each other? Well, I don't know if that's been at the top of the list. And so when you look at that, when you're coming to the table to help negotiations, again, whether it's countries or individuals at the home table, how often do you find or do you always, that's what you're doing? Now, we're not looking for equitable terms. We're looking to understand. We're looking for empathy. Is that always the case?
Well, maybe not always the case, but more often the case than not, I would say. And so much of it, if I had to say, there's, people often ask me, so as a negotiator, what's the most important skill you need? And the one that comes up the most for me is it's the ability to put yourself in the shoes of the other person and try to understand how they see the situation, what they want and what they need. And the reason is because in negotiation, we're trying to influence the other side. We're trying to, maybe change their mind. How can we possibly change their mind if we don't know where their mind is and where their heart is and what they really care about and what drives them? It goes back to your thing. What drives you? Yeah. That's really what negotiation is all about, is to get, it's like an iceberg. You only see on the surface what's at the top, but what's underneath that you can't see? What are the underlying interests and needs and fears and concerns that drive people? I find in negotiation that if we can do that, if we can understand what really drives the other side by listening to them, and that's the key, that's the key behavior we need in negotiation. It's less about talking than about listening. We can listen for what drives them and articulate what drives us, then we can often find solutions that are unexpected that actually leave us both happy and everyone around us happy.
Okay, so on that, you mentioned changing someone's mind. So again, we're looking at the negotiation table, and you've got two countries on either side or two people, whatever it is. That I would venture to say, I'm thinking of my own experience, that you're often, of course, you'd love the other person to change their mind and just see everything your way. I mean, that'd be easy. That's obviously not what's happening, or we wouldn't be across the table from each other. In your negotiations, how often do you find, we kind of get things out there and one side sees the light, they see it differently and they come over here? Or how often is that? I mean, if you can give, I don't know if it's fair to ask a ratio, a percentage of how often that happens, or is it, no, neither of them really changed, but they did understand. And from that, we were able to come to some terms that were fair to both sides.
More often than not.
Okay.
And let me give you an example. You're talking about countries. When I was starting off just in the beginning, there was I had a little tiny role in a peace summit that took place, Camp David, 1978. President Jimmy Carter brought together Egypt, the leader of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, and the leader of Israel, Menachem Begin. And Egypt and Israel had fought 4 wars in the previous 30 years. I mean, they were arch enemies. And he was hoping this was a last-ditch effort to try to see if there could be some kind of peace agreement. He brought them to Camp David, which is a place in the forest. It's kind of the woods. Bring them out to the woods. And I was actually, it was Rosalind's idea to kind of bring them to a place of nature, where they can kind of like relax. Their nervous systems can relax. And Egypt wanted, this whole Sinai back. They wanted the entire Sinai back. That was their position. And Israel was insisting on keeping a third of it. And, and there was no way that they could actually reach an agreement.
Yeah.
The secret to reaching the agreement was for the Americans to ask the Egyptians, why do you want sovereign? Why do you want the Sinai back? What's the driver there? What do you really want? And for the Egyptians, it turned out to be sovereignty. The land had been there since the time of the pharaohs. They wanted it back. It was sovereignty. It was like they wanted that. And what was it for the Israelis? It was security. That's why they wanted to keep a third of it, right?
Yeah.
It was security. Once you got beneath the level of where the line in the sand would be in the desert to what were the drivers, security and sovereignty, they were able to come up with a creative idea, which was a demilitarized Sinai, a Sinai where, the Egyptian flag could fly everywhere. They got total sovereignty. They got the whole thing back, but Egyptian tanks could go nowhere. So it was brilliant. It gave the Israelis a bigger buffer than a third, the whole Sinai, and it gave the Egyptians everything that they wanted. So that's what you do. That's the secret of negotiation, is to drive behind the positions, the things that people say they want, like where the line is going to be, to what really drives them, what really motivates them, what's really underneath it, which in this case was security and sovereignty. And they were to come up with a creative solution of a demilitarized Sinai. That's what we need to do, whether it's in the small or the large. That's the art of negotiation.
So getting to the underlying why, which, of course, for the sake of this show, the drive, what is that core drive, and how often are we, again, at the veritable table together, and we're not even talking about the real issue? I mean, again, I feel like I keep asking for stats because I'm so curious on that. Like, how often do you get brought to the table? Here you are, flown in from wherever or doing whatever. Do you just expect that right off the bat? Okay, we're going to sit down, and you're an investigator at this point. You're a private investigator. You're a detective trying to figure out, okay, you guys say what you want, you say what you want, and right off the bat, that's probably not it most of the time.
Most of the time, by far the majority of the time, to give you, and you're absolutely right about being an investigator. You come in with an open mind, an open heart, even better, and you come in curious. You meet animosity with curiosity. I mean, that's the key. You're just curious. You just ask questions, and negotiation. Even though we think of it as making statements, it's a lot more about asking questions. Asking good questions like you're asking right now, like you ask on your podcast, open-ended questions. How would you do this? I understand that you won't agree under these conditions. Are there conditions under which you might possibly agree? Why do you want that? Why is that important to you? What if we were to do it this way? Those kinds of questions open up the conversation and often lead these kind of polarized positions where we're just tussling with each other into an open-ended inquiry into what can satisfy what drives you and what can satisfy what drives me.
It makes me think of so here we are in a conflict, which often both people they're triggered or they're striving not to be, either way, but it's on the cusp, it's there. And we have that perspective, which I've never really appreciated the concept of being the bigger person. Nobody wants to, it feels, egotistical and superior and whatever. But you just got me thinking of, can I just be the more curious person? Or can I just be let's even take can I just be a curious person? Let's not say more. Let's put it, can I just enter in and not be a triggered person, not be a victim, we could put a lot of terms there, but can I just be a curious person? If I was forced to say, Kevin, for the first 5 responses, you are not allowed with your wife, your kid, your partner, your business, you're not allowed to state anything. You have to ask a question, which for me should be easy. Kevin, treat it all like a podcast. You only ask questions for the most part. I mean, that's in essence what you're saying now. That's some of the secret sauce. Yes.
That's absolutely it. You don't have to have all the answers. You just come with some very good questions, and those questions will lead you in the direction of opening up the situation. And then pretty soon, this is what I find. I find so many situations where it absolutely seems impossible to everyone. But if you just kind of, let's back off a little bit, let's go to, I like to use that phrase, go to the balcony, kind of like, it's like you're on a stage, kind of get a little bit of that bigger picture, a little bit of detachment, a little bit of perspective. And then let's just see what's there. And often as not, things open up, possibilities open up that you couldn't have imagined. That's why, when people ask me, am I an optimist? Am I a pessimist? I say, I'm actually a possibilist. I believe in possibilities. And that's what you're looking for is, you don't have to have a certain answer, just looking for where the possibilities are, even in the most challenging of situations.
Okay, and this is where, again, I'm normally doing this with a past guest. You just heard some stuff about the balcony and being conflict, talking about emotion. You're going to hear that, folks. When this publishes, give it a couple of weeks. We're going to dive into that further when I have the series with Bill on, and we're talking about conflict and resolution there and negotiating and whatnot. But in this, coming back to trauma, and you said, as I was questioning that, you said felt trauma. I'm going to assume that at the negotiation table, you are trying to help both sides understand, have some understanding of the other's felt trauma, even if they don't agree. And I hear this a lot. I've heard this in therapy, and I get it intellectually. It is still hard for me, for my heart to step in there to go, okay, I'm hearing your perception of the trauma. In this case, let's say it's, caused by me. You feel it's caused by me. And it tears me up. That's the last thing I want to do is for somebody to feel like I caused them trauma. Of course I want to be defensive. That's not what I meant. That's not what I did, whatever. And yet over here, it's what they felt. What they felt is what they felt. So if I can stop, come back again and be curious and go, okay. As much as that levels me to hear that, tell me more. Help me understand more. Is this key negotiation?
That's it. No, you're onto it. It's not easy. This, I would say, let's just start off by being honest here. This can be some of the hardest work human beings can do.
Yeah,
it's not easy to do this. It's not easy to hear things you don't want to hear.
Yeah.
It's not easy to set aside your own defensiveness. I do the same thing. Believe me, I'm going through the same things all the time, and I've been doing this for years. I'm always learning. It's always learning the basic lessons of pause, bite your tongue, listen, try to empathize. This is hard work, but the good news is that these are all human potentials. Yeah. We're all built, we have mirror neurons. We're built with the ability to empathize, to what Thomas talks about, attunement, attuned, we have nervous systems. And this is what I love about his work is that we can attune. In other words, feel in. My nervous system can kind of, if I really listen to it, can feel your nervous system. I can feel a little, if I pay attention to my body, this is what I've learned from Thomas, I can sort of, there's a little bit of tension here. Where is that from? Or I pick up on a little bit of tension. We're stressed, or are we open? And it's just to notice that. It's not to judge it. It's just to notice it. And that's one thing I love about his work too, is trauma is not something, it's not something to be ashamed of. It's not something to cover up. It's what he explains. It's the intelligent response of a child or of a human being to overwhelm. It's like a computer. When the computer gets too much information, it shuts down.
Yeah.
That's what happens with trauma. And we all go through that at some point or another. And it's just, okay. And what heals that is non-judgmental, compassionate attention that we pay to ourselves or that others pay to us. It's that deep listening. It's that attunement. It's that I hear you. I see you. I love the story. I love the story of how he, with his daughter, his little daughter, she's scared, the father, I remember this guy, I have a daughter too, was like, you want to fix things. No, just listen to the child. Take your daughter into your arms. Just don't say you shouldn't be scared, because just acknowledge what she's feeling, and just that lets it go. It passes it through. It's that kind of compassionate attention that I think we all would benefit from practicing.
Okay, let me ask you on there and getting real and candid, whether when a kid especially has a problem, something happened, for me to connect and have empathy, to have compassion for something that they encountered out here with a friend or at school or whatever it may be at the workplace or whatnot, is not that difficult. It's very, and I can step into this place much easier. When, however, that person, their trauma is directed at me, which is what you're doing when you're sitting across the table again from, two countries at war or a possible war where they are throwing accusations at each other. So to take that ability, give me that, focus on an accusation, how you facilitate that empathy, connectedness, compassion when you have accusation. So here's, nation B over here, and you're sitting there and they accuse nation A, and you're saying, nation A, you need to understand this. And nation A is going, dude, I am not accepting that accusation over here, or that, I don't want to. That's when it feels like, okay, this is the difficult side over here. If something happened to you and you're relating what happened to you at work and it doesn't have to do with me, man, I can step in there. When it's me, I've been in therapy for that one.
Yeah, no, believe me, I know that place. I'll just give you one example. Many years ago, I was facilitating a conversation between some of the top leadership of Russia and the top leadership of Chechnya, which was fighting in a war of independence against Russia and had been fighting, over the generations for many generations. And the war was hot and heavy, and thousands of people were dying. And we were meeting in The Hague, and in the Peace Palace there, and the vice president began. We happened to be meeting in the same room where the War Crimes Tribunal was taking place for Yugoslavia at the time, and the conversation began with the vice president of Chechnya pointing his finger at the Russian National Security Advisor and saying, "You should stay right here in this room because you're going to be on trial for war crimes." And he just went on with a whole litany of accusations, like you were saying. And he went into the whole history of all the suffering of the people of Chechnya at the hands of the Russians over centuries. I mean, the conversation, went on for at least an hour. And he was just furious. And then, you could just see so much trauma there. And then he turned to me in that hot, stuffy room, and he pointed his finger at me. He said, "You're an American, and you Americans are supporting the Russians. And by the way, you're oppressing the people of Puerto Rico. And tell me, what do you think of Puerto Rico?" And suddenly I'm on the spot. I was the facilitator, but I'm on the spot. And, and I was, it had been a long day. It was hot. And I was thinking, what do I know about Puerto Rico? And then I realized, oh, it's not about Puerto Rico. And so I paused for a moment. And pausing is one of the best things you can do in a negotiation. It's just a little moment of silence can help. And I had the kind of, it's translated. So I had a little bit of chance to pause. And I turned to him and I said, Mr. Vice President, first of all, let me say, we are all, the suffering of the Chechen people over the centuries is palpable. And right now, I hear that. I hear that, and I could, we all feel that right now here in the room. And the question is, how do we stop the suffering? Yeah. And I take your criticism of my country as a sign that we're among friends and we can talk candidly to each other. And right now we need to turn the conversation back to how do we stop this war? Well, the conversation shifted back to how do we get a ceasefire, which we ultimately, succeeded in doing. But it was those moments when the accusations are flying back and forth, the ability to pause for a moment, take a moment of silence, try to remember what it's all about. And then, you're criticizing me. So I'm going to interpret that as a sign that we're among friends and we can speak candidly to each other. That was kind of the little reframe that helped get the conversation back on track.
I'm curious on this note too, Bill, I had a therapist do this once, and they said, I can't remember, I should, but I can't remember the the incident, but it was something where I felt like I didn't participate. I didn't cause that. I'm not responsible for this, person's behavior or the response. And she said, "Now, wait a minute. I want you to think about how did you had a part. It kind of takes two to tango. You had a part. How did you set this up? How did your even your non-participation, non-engagement, how did that set it up?" And I think that's what it was. It was something where I didn't engage. She said that by proxy caused this response. You still had a part. So even where I thought that I was not, you still had a part. And that I play that in my head a lot when I, feel something. How did I participate? How did I set it up? I wouldn't be, and I kind of have just taken the aspect of, I wouldn't be here in this conflict. There would not be any negotiation unless I had done something or hadn't done something.
Yeah. That's it.
Okay.
And that's the key. I mean, the thing is, the problem in conflict is the blame game, right? That's what we're talking about. Each side blaming the other, right? What you were doing and what the therapist was suggesting is you change the game from the blame game to the responsibility game. Responsibility doesn't mean blame. It's not that you're not even at fault, but the truth is responsibility means the ability to respond. That you are, since you're part of the relationship, you co-created the situation, even if it's just a tiny little bit. I've had to learn this lesson so many times myself. We don't want to, but it's not about blame. It's just about responsibility. And when you take responsibility, which is the ability to respond, you are empowering yourself, because if you have the power then to change the situation. And so there's the shift between blame and responsibility. They're two very different things. You don't need the pointing finger. It's just like, no, of course, I'm responsible for the things that happen around me. I play some role. Even if I said nothing, I'm playing a little bit of a role. I'm co-creating the situation. And that shift, that reframe from blame to responsibility is the shift that we need to transform the conflict.
Okay, I can't hear you say that without I'm going to steal from our upcoming conversation. So folks, you're going to hear this again, and I'm just going to assume that you need to, like I do as well. So this is from me talking with you a few weeks ago. And I don't know if you said this. I think it might be out of your book. It was it was what got you started in your profession. And it was how to tell if negotiations are going poorly or well. And your response in your youth even here was, oh, gosh, if it's going poorly, I usually see, to what you just said, blame. They're mired in the past. They're focusing on what's wrong. If it's going well, they're not talking about the past, but they're talking about the present and the future. Instead of focusing on what's wrong, they're focusing on what can be done. Instead of attacking each other, they're attacking the problem jointly. I mean, I don't know how I want to frame that. I mean, that's maturity. That's it's both of you being the bigger person is there. But I mean, you've gotten me ever since I read that. I'm thinking, okay, now every time I look at a conflict or start to get riled up or triggered, I'm going, okay, how is this going to go well? If I blame, if I talk about the past, I mean, that's got to be the number one. I mean, in therapy overall, especially like couples therapy or family therapy, or relational therapy, it's been when you start talking about the past, you're pretty much in trouble. And yet when we look at that, like some of the, even the examples that you've talked about, I mean, there is a place to cite the past, but not blame, right?
Right. For sure. No, you want to talk about, you could talk about the past insofar as the past is part of the present. And there's something to be, if you have the intention to heal it. But if it's the intention to go back and settle who's right, who's wrong, you're all, and who's to blame, that's a game that never ends.
Goodness. Okay. Well, when you look at, let me come back and ask that. You looking at negotiation, Thomas, and you're talking about conflict. He's over here on, trauma. Again, I want to feel, and as most people are listening to this, they're not dealing with global conflicts or nations against nations. They're talking about their individual lives or maybe at work and whatnot. They're looking there and to realize how much of the time when they are sitting there and they think they're trying again to negotiate some terms, they need to look, what is the felt trauma? You're saying that word, you said that a minute ago, that we shouldn't be ashamed of that word. I'll admit to you, Bill, I do still struggle even with speaking to it that way. Because when I talk about business and you get people negotiating, they're not thinking about trauma. And if you bring up that word, they're going to go, wait a minute, this isn't trauma. We're just trying to find something equitable here. How do we do justice to it?
I'm not saying it's always going to be trauma is the most relevant thing, like in like a business transaction, but particularly like in a family situation, often in a family business situation, things get elicited from the past, and trauma is this kind of area under the bottom that can influence things, and it's just good to know about it. It's why it's a lifelong practice of like. But the key thing I would say, in a business negotiation, whatever, that is relevant here is listening.
Yeah.
If you listen to them, even forget about trauma, but just listen to them, hear what drives them, hear what they're afraid of. All those things may be in a deep psychic sense related to trauma, but it doesn't matter. Just listen to them, hear where they're coming from. That will convey respect.
Yeah.
Respect is the cheapest concession you can make in a negotiation. It costs you nothing, but it means everything to the other side, of course. And it also gives you valuable information about what they want so that you can then have a much better chance of arriving at a solution that is equitable, as you say.
Okay, I just wrote that down. Respect is the cheapest concession. Gosh, that even brings me back to some of the early parenting counsel that we got, that you can give a child a reprimand, you can discipline even, and you can do it with anger and frustration and all these negative emotions, or you can do it over here and do it in respect. There's still a consequence. There still may be a something that's, that's very distasteful to the child that you can do, but you can still do it with, love and respect to that degree. And for you to bring that forward here, it calls us all up to take a deep breath. And, I don't know what doesn't come down to this so often in every show that I do, this aspect of being aware. We've got to be aware. To your standpoint, which folks, you're going to hear this in 2 or 3 weeks as we talk about it, of take a minute, get on the balcony, assess what's going on, and not just react, which is maybe that's, like you said, this is one of the hardest things ever. I appreciate you saying that this is not, we talk about this. You've got a book about this. Thomas has a book. We're talking about these issues, but this right here may be the hardest journey that we can ever go on, and yet maybe the most beneficial ever, as you've experienced.
It is.
Yeah.
That's it, Kevin. This is all, I just want to say, how about possibilist? This is all our human potential. It's not rocket science. It's the things that you already know, but you need to just develop. And if we can do that, if we can do these things, we can take our conflicts, we can turn them around, we can transform them into positive, constructive solutions, vibrant relationships. And if we can transform our conflicts, we can transform our lives, and then we can transform the world. And that's really what it's all about. Well,
I can't top that there. That's a great place to anchor right there. I do want to thank, again, Thomas Hübl is our muse here for this series. His book is Attuned: Practicing Interdependence to Heal Our Trauma and Our World. I am right now with William Ury and his upcoming book. Again, you can pre-order it now. It'll be out when this episode comes out. I think, it'll be right at the beginning of February. And you said the book comes out February 21?
20. February
so 20. So you can pre-order it now. And if you go there, you can see the stats. People are already doing that quite a bit. But that book is called Possible: How We Survive and Thrive in an Age of Conflict. And then if the book's coming out February 20, it's probably right around when our series is going to come out, talking about conflict and going deeper with you. Man, thank you so much for being here again. Is there any other specific place that you would have people connect with you other than obviously going to check out the book?
Well, if they want, I have a website. It's just my name, WilliamUry.com.
Okay.
For sure, there's some resources there for people.
Well, thank you. And folks, if you want to comment on this, go to Spotify, go to Apple Podcasts, leave a review and tell what you learned from this show that we did together. You can find us on the clips and everything on social media, kevinmiller.co. And this is all about how it affects your drive. You can check out my book, What Drives You, on Amazon. Until next time, friends, stay driven.
Yeah.